Thank you everyone for joining our event today. I think it'll be a really interesting session on how and why we should engage with the Conservative Party. We're delighted to be joined for this discussion by Sam Hall, who is Director of the Conservative Environment Network, otherwise known as SEN. Before I briefly introduce Sam, I'd be grateful if you could all please pop your names and organisation in your Zoom profiles. And also, if you're comfortable putting your cameras on, please do so, especially for the Q&A segment of this event. We are recording the session, and as always, we'll upload it to the website afterwards. So, as mentioned, Sam has been the director at SEN for over 5 years now, having previously served as a policy advisor to Michael Gove during his time in DEFRA. Sam was also the head of research at the Liberal Conservative think tank Bright Blue, leading their work on energy and the environment, which makes him very well placed to lead this discussion today. For the first of this event, Sam will be delivering his presentation, and for the second half, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So, without further ado, Sam, I'll pass over to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Nadia, and thank you everyone for your time this afternoon. Hopefully it'll be a useful session. So hopefully the Green Lights team are going to help me with projecting the slides. Fantastic. I will get started then. So just on the next slide, I've just got a bit of background for those of you who haven't come across our work at the Conservative Environment Network before, but I thought it'd be a useful starting point. So our mission is to promote environmental action and issues within the Conservative movement and tradition. We kind of recognise that politics can often be quite tribal and that people often are more receptive to ideas and to policy suggestions when they come from people of the same political tribe. So what we try and do as SEN is gather together and convene and coordinate a network of Conservative politicians at every different level, from Parliament down to the grassroots, who sign up to 8 high-level principles around environmental action and then work with them on specific environmental campaigns to organise events and to amplify their voices in the media and in Parliament as well. And we work across the full suite of environmental issues, from clean air to climate change to nature to international environment issues as well. Next slide, please. And really kind of what we're trying and doing at SEN, I suppose, is sort of reconnecting Conservatives with the long-standing environmental heritage that has existed within the Conservative movement, going from the kind of philosophers like Edmund Burke, who often used as the sort of grandfather of Conservative philosophy, through to kind of more contemporary political figures like Margaret Thatcher. There has been that long green thread running through conservatism, and I think it often gets forgotten. So a big part of what SEN is doing is trying to kind of promote those voices and that environmental heritage. So on this next slide, I'm going to talk a bit about kind of the current political context. Oh, sorry, can you go back one more slide? The current political context, and I think some of the factors that are driving Conservative politics at the moment. So first one is a fairly obvious one, but there are not that many Conservative MPs now. There's only 121. And all those MPs have got huge demands on their time, from being on select committees to having shadow ministerial roles to being involved in all party parliamentary groups to having constituency issues to focus on. Some of them even have 2 shadow ministerial roles to do, for example. There are obviously some MPs as well who served at the top of government for a number of years and who are kind of having a rest. People like Rishi Sunak and Oliver Dowden and Steve Barclay and a whole bunch of others. So there really isn't a lot of, I suppose the point I really want to stress is that MPs are very stretched and very busy, and there's a lot of demands on the time of the few remaining Conservative MPs that there are. Layering onto that, I think it's also true to say we lost a lot of the most vocal and active Green Conservative MPs at the last election, whether through retirements, people like Philip Dunn or Alok Sharma deciding not to stand again, or people who just lost their seat, like Simon Clarke or Vicky Ford or Peter Alders. And whilst we have now got around 50 SEN MPs in our parliamentary caucus, and there are some champions within that who we've engaged with and who are active, I think it's true to say that some of the newer ones in particular don't have as much confidence to talk about the environment, and don't have the same familiarity with the policy context. So I think that's really important to bear in mind. Another key factor is, and this has been reported on in the media a bit, the Conservatives don't really have very much money. They have struggled, obviously, with fundraising because of the leadership contest, because a lot of their donors have been tempted over to reform because the polling position obviously still hasn't really recovered. And so, yeah, as a result, there's a real shortage of cash to, for example, hire political advisors. Again, it just makes it very hard to engage with shadow ministerial teams if they don't have that sort of capacity that can help shadow ministers do the kind of detailed policy thinking. I think certainly when it comes to the policy reviews, I think the lack of sort of support within shadow ministers' offices is going to be a challenge. A lot of shadow ministers are being told that if they want someone to help them with their shadow brief, that's got to be funded out of their IPSA parliamentary budget. So yeah, that also puts other pressures on the kind of rest of their time if they don't have as much parliamentary office support as well. Um, Third big factor is that the Conservatives don't yet have any policies. So I don't know how many of you follow closely the Conservative leadership contest, but Kemi ran on the platform of not essentially leaping into making firm policy commitments. She instead wanted to set out some broad principles and to kind of develop policy with the help of the grassroots and the MPs over a period of a couple of years. She didn't want to kind of rush into headline grabbing, kind of crowd pleasing policies, which she didn't really know how she would be able to deliver. So wanted to take her time on things. So again, I think this makes it quite difficult, again, to kind of have a deep engagement on policy with Conservative politicians at the moment because there just is a lot of uncertainty about exactly when these policies are going to be clearer. And I also think the kind of default instinct of a lot of shadow ministers will just be to attack and oppose. They're not really thinking about what a kind of Conservative government might do after the next election. It's sort of more just instinctive opposition until a kind of longer term sustainable policy agenda is being developed. I think definitely don't assume though that things that used to be the case, used to be supported by the last Conservative government would still be. We've had some examples already on things like the deposit return scheme where the Conservatives have switched their position. So a lot is in flux on policy. And then the final sort of macro trend, I suppose, to pull out is reform, and to an extent Donald Trump as well. Reform, obviously polling very well. They certainly at the last general election mostly took votes from the Conservatives, although I think in recent months they're taking more and more votes from Labour as well. The Conservative MPs are worried about reform, and they're uncertain exactly how to approach them. There is definitely a school of thought that thinks you've got to ape their policy agenda and sort of suck the oxygen out of their attacks, occupy the same ground, kind of solidify your right flank, and then you can go and take the attack to Labour. I think others that worry that attacking them or sort of trying to take them on risks in front of inflating their salience and potentially as well alienating supporters of Farage who take attacks on Farage as attacks on themselves. And I think there are some people that really worry about the long-term future of the Conservative Party if kind of reform doesn't fizzle away, and it's more of a flash in the pan. Obviously important to keep stressing that net zero is not what is driving the shift to reform. If it's a policy issue, it is immigration. All the polling bears that out. But nonetheless, people are saying that to defeat reform, you've got to copy them on everything. And then similarly, I think with Trump's victory has sort of emboldened the right of the Conservative Party as well. And whilst I wouldn't say the whole of the Conservative Party is pro-Trump, I definitely think there are people who admire aspects of his agenda. And I think they've kind of gained an intellectual self-confidence from his victory and the speed with which he's pushed through lots of the deregulation, the anti-woke agenda that he's been pursuing. Next slide, please. So briefly, just to run through who some of the key individuals are in the shadow cabinet. On different environmental topics, obviously we've got Claire Coutinho, who's now on maternity leave, expected to be back in September. She was in the Sen Caucus when she first got elected in 2019 and did some work with us on nature on the Wild Belt. I think since she's had the job at DESNZ before the election, she's had growing concerns about some of the kind of economic impacts of net zero, some of the policy mechanisms and approaches that were being taken to deliver our climate targets, and I think has been continuing and has been more vocal in developing that critique outside of government. Andrew Bowie is covering for Claire as Shadow DESNZ while she's on mat leave. He obviously represents a very pro-oil and gas part of the UK, but I think also is quite a big supporter of the energy transition on the basis that he recognises that the long-term future of places like the northeast of Scotland depends on getting the next generation of energy jobs in sectors like hydrogen, carbon capture, offshore winds, and so on. Very passionate about nuclear, also has some local issues with pylons and onshore wind as well that's worth being aware of. Kemi Badenoch herself, one of the few MPs to speak in the net zero debate in 2019, spoke against it broadly. She didn't vote against it, but she raised concerns about the cost. And when she was business secretary, she's also had various concerns about impacts of new regulations on the environment, on business, and I think as quite a free market view of the world, and as a sort of avowed self-declared net zero skeptic. Andrew Griffith next, who is the Shadow Business and Trade Secretary, very interested in nature, has got the NEPA state in his patch. He's done some work with us in this Parliament in recent months on marine issues. I think also probably shares, though, Kemi Badenoch's sort of deregulatory instincts. And interestingly, he was the one rather than the Shadow DEFRA team that fronted up the deposit return scheme opposition. Then you've got Kevin Hollenrake, who's the Shadow Housing, Communities and Local Government Secretary. He was in the Sen Caucus pretty much from the beginning, has had a long-standing interest in the environment. I think probably also shares the kind of deregulatory instincts of Kemi, though. Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, included him really because he made some positive noises about the kind of green economic opportunities during his leadership bid. Gave us a good quote as part of his leadership bid during the contest last summer. Potentially a kind of an ally, I think. Alex Burghardt, very close to Kemi. Shadow Duchy of Lancaster, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. He's overseeing the policy review process. So quite important from that perspective. Gareth Bacon, he's the Shadow Transport Secretary, formerly kind of GLA Conservative, so see strong anti-ULEZ campaigner. And then lastly, Victoria Atkins, who Shadow DEFRA Secretary. She has, I think, put a big emphasis in the early months of her time in the role on farming issues, on the so-called family farm tax. I think there's been a big emphasis among Conservatives to try and win back the farmer vote, and that issue was seen as a good route into doing that. Water, I know, has been another key focus. I think the Conservatives sense that they've been massively on the back foot on that and want to try and get back on the front foot. And she's done some stuff with us on the Water Restoration Fund since in the last few weeks to try and regain the initiative. I think has good intentions on sort of developing a broader environmental agenda in the brief. Once she gets time, and I think is broadly an ally in the Shadow Cabinet. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I just wanted to touch on what I think some of the challenging debates are for the environmental movement that are happening within the Conservative movement. Problems that I think challenge a lot of the dominant narratives in the sector, and where I think yeah, these arguments are happening, and I think the sector is just useful to so you're all aware of them. I think the first one to pull out is a kind of growing skepticism among parts of the right about the sort of legal architecture of a lot of environmental law, legally binding targets, a kind of system where governments have outsourced or taken certain decisions away from ministers, given them to regulators, arm's length bodies. I think there's a fear that too much policy making has been taken out of the hands of democratic ministers and put into the hands of courts and quangos. And I think that prevents ministers from being able to yeah, fully deliver the various objectives they want to meet. They feel they're politically accountable for lots of the outcomes that these courts and regulators are actually delivering, and they don't themselves have the levers to affect change. I think, secondly, there are obvious bits of the last Conservative government legacy on the environment, which I think are increasingly, and they were a bit at the time, but I think increasingly so now, seen as quite statist, quite left wing, kind of too much of a deviation from sort of conservative economic thinking. I think particularly I'd pull out the zero emission vehicle mandate and the clean heat market mechanism. I don't think the policy on the zero emission vehicle mandate has been set yet. It is still possible that that gets retained, but yeah, I think the mood generally and the kind of principles that Kemi talked about a lot during her leadership contest around, there's too much regulation. We want to get back to kind of smaller government, more kind of pure free market thinking. Suggest policies like that are going to struggle, I think, under the new leadership. Thirdly, there's a big debate going on about economic growth, and I think the sort of sluggish growth in living standards under 14 years of Conservative government is one of the big reasons, alongside immigration, why the party lost so heavily. The new government is also obviously very focused on growth as well, and trying to unlock growth. And I think there's a similar sort of debate, to be honest, within the Conservative Party about whether some environmental measures have contributed to the slowing down of growth. So some people would point to our high energy prices, and would blame renewables and the balancing cost that renewables are posing on the system for high energy prices. I don't know whether people have seen the essay Foundations that did the rounds on social media around September, October by three sort of centre-right economic thinkers. But that gives you a flavour of the thinking, and that was very widely shared across the party. I think the kind of environmental regulations as well, which obviously some of which the Labour government is acting on and seeking to reform. I think again that's also part of the narrative. And then lastly, I think, and this is partly I think been brought on by the Trump election, but I think it was also there in the background before that. But I think there are people questioning in the party whether the net zero strategy, the kind of climate leadership strategy, is working. If a couple of sort of key bits of the logic chain no longer seem to hold. So the first one being, we, by going first, setting an example, showing you can grow the economy and decarbonize at the same time, other countries will want to follow our lead. The argument goes, well, if you've got really high energy prices and your growth is slower than you want it to be, it's not really a lead that other people want to follow. It's not acting as that leadership example. And as we're only 1%, we need other countries to follow suit if it's going to work, and get to the global net zero outcome that we need to stop climate change. And the other aspect being, and this is specific on Trump, but if Donald Trump is not driving American action towards net zero further over the next 4 years, and countries like Indonesia, this has done the rounds recently in the last week, are also seemingly pulling back, and we're not getting that kind of global response if other people aren't following our lead. So I think making the kind of first principles case for kind of net zero, I think, is also coming under strain from people across the party. Next slide. Why engage with the opposition? So yeah, I think there are three main reasons to do so. I think firstly, I mean, who knows what will happen in politics in 4 years' time? It's obviously incredibly volatile, but um, Labour is currently looking pretty unpopular. The prospects, I think, of Labour's re-election depend very heavily on them getting enough economic growth for people to feel the increase in living standards. And I think that obviously looks quite a risky bet at the moment, given all the forecasts on growth. So um, I think it's very possible that there'll be a change of government in 5 years' time. It could be the Conservatives, it could be Reform, it could be a combination. We obviously don't know, but I think in any case, it is absolutely worth paying attention to a party that could well be part of the next government, and they will, be mindful of who is engaging them now and who is staying involved in conversations with them. When it gets closer to the time of the next election and they look like they might become in power, I think seeking to build those relationships, seeking to make sure that key things that you want to see happen can survive a changing government, is going to be crucial for making sure the wins that we can get in this parliament with a Labour government endure and are not undermined. The next point is around sort of pressuring, and here I think there's sort of helpful and unhelpful pressure. Obviously, you want to encourage the helpful pressure, you want to discourage the unhelpful pressure, but the helpful pressure. So there's no way I think, in the House of Commons that the Conservatives are ever going to be able to defeat Labour. The numbers are the majority is so large. But I think they can still apply pressure through the media and through the dispatch box, and just the power of making these points. And they can also, I think, bring numbers to bear more in the House of Lords, where Labour doesn't have a majority. So I think there is a meaningful form of parliamentary pressure that opposition parties can still put on the government to direct and influence policy indirectly. An example, in the last time Conservatives were in opposition of helpful pressure was during the climate change bill's passage through Parliament, where Conservative pressure helped to get the target from 60 to 80% and various other bits of strengthening of the Act. Similarly, you could well imagine that strident Conservative opposition on lots of aspects of the environmental agenda could force Labour to, particularly when coupled with Reform, to row back and backslide on some of their things. And you saw that a bit pre-election with some of the attacks on Labour's 28 billion, which led to them rowing back on that commitment. So I think oppositions can help to create either an unhelpful or a helpful political backdrop that can influence government policy. And then lastly, I'd just say it is, this is a crucial time for the cross-party consensus on the end goals of climate action and nature loss and clean air. And I think we absolutely have to try and keep as much of that there as possible. It's, I think, something that is relatively unique about the UK in English-speaking countries, at least. And it's obviously really important for investment, for continued environmental action. I think it is something that we should absolutely try and make sure that we keep. And I think engaging with the opposition, whilst they're having these very big intellectual debates about lots of environmental policy, is crucial to getting the right answer out of those big debates. A few thoughts on how. I mean, my first point is sort of linked to my earlier observation about the fact there were only 121 MPs. I think a lot of Conservative MPs are just going to take their lead from the relevant shadow minister for that brief. So I think try and get to know the shadow front bench teams as much as possible. I think there isn't really a kind of backbencher role in the same way as there was in the last parliament. Pretty much everyone has a shadow ministerial role, because there are just so few MPs. So I think do go through the shadow front bench. Next point, do ask us. I mean, we're really happy to help advise on MPs who might be interested in different campaigns. We've published our list of caucus members on our website in the last few weeks, so do have a look at that. Obviously, there are ranges of interests and commitment and environmental ambitions within that list, but it gives you a bit of a rough guide as to who might be interested in environmental topics more generally. And we're always happy to help on framing or to give frank advice on campaigns and how they might go down with Conservatives. I think try and put yourself in the mind of what a Conservative MP is going to be looking for right now. I think they're looking for ammunition, basically, ways to score runs against the government. So if you've got an environmental critique, maybe something that the last government did quite well, this government isn't doing so well on, feed that in. It might well be just the sort of thing they could throw into a speech in the chamber, and very much is kind of the space that they're in. And I think going back to my earlier point about pressure, that would very much encourage the Conservatives to be applying the right sort of helpful pressure on the Labour government. Um, I think the fourth point, it just be to, and this goes back to earlier slides, I think the debate has moved on quite a bit since the Boris Johnson days on the environment within the Conservative Party. There was a lot more scepticism. Kemi is an avowed net zero skeptic. I think we have to acknowledge that in terms of kind of when we pitch them ideas, the centre of gravity in the party has changed. And I think look back to Kemi's speeches on what her conservative principles are, and as much as possible, try and tailor your asks and your campaigns to those principles. It is a very policy light leadership so far. She's not really said very much at all. And so I think that does give a lot of scope for campaign groups and others to propose policies for the policy review process that fit with some of the principles that she sketched out. I think, yeah, linked to the point about feeding in Conservative MP environmental critiques, I think try and be helpful. There are so many sort of capacity constraints in Conservative MPs' offices at the moment that the more you can help them with ideas for Westminster Hall debates or written parliamentary questions or things like that, I think some MPs won't want to table those for external groups, but some will, and some will be glad of the ammunition. So and when they don't have a lot of in-house capacity in their offices, will welcome having some sensible suggestions from external groups. And then lastly, yeah, I think don't be afraid to point out some positive bits of the Conservative legacy as well. Obviously, it wasn't a perfect legacy. Obviously, there was some people in the Conservative Party that think it was too green and that we went too far in some places. But I think generally Conservatives will respond well to being reminded of things that the last government did that they can feel some pride and some ownership in. Next slide, please. So on these next two slides, I was going to hone in on some policy specifics to try and give you some ideas of what specific areas you might want to focus your engagements on, where I think there's sort of a pro-environment sentiment within certainly some bits of the Conservative Party. The post-Brexit agricultural schemes, the environmental management schemes, I think obviously, there have been teething pains with the rollout, but I think broadly MPs are on board with the principles of those schemes now. And there's certainly a lot of common cause to be made around the size of the funding and the budget. So I think do keep plugging those. Post-Brexit marine protections, I think again, we found a lot of mileage in getting MPs defending things like the sand eels fishing ban, things like the bottom trawling ban in MPAs, particularly given the risk that those might be up for negotiation in the Brexit reset. That there's been a lot of interest in MPs in getting involved in some of those campaigns. Climate adaptation, I think again we've not a very controversial topic, but I think flooding, in particular, flooding of farmland, flooding rural communities, is something that Conservative MPs are really interested in. And I'm also up for nature-based solutions as well in climate adaptation policy. So definitely get involved in that. I think Bioenergy skepticism is another area that we've had some joy with Conservative MPs. Definitely a few of the big biomass skeptics have left Parliament at the last election, but I think particularly in the House of Lords, there's a lot of people with concerns about that. And I know this idea that we're wasting money on green subsidies that don't actually deliver the environmental benefit that's claimed. Nuclear, I think this is the one bit of energy policy that Conservatives do seem very vocal about. I still know that there are mixed views about it within some bits of the environmental movement, but it's definitely a bit of clean power that Conservatives are very keen to champion. And then I think the last one I pull out is around sort of protecting local consent in the planning system. I think there is nervousness about some of Labour's planning reforms among Conservative MPs and what it might mean for inappropriate development, urban sprawl, the role of local democracy, and so on. There definitely is a kind of YIMBY wing of the Conservative Party, but my sense is that the front bench and the kind of bulk of MPs sense that their voter base is very much unwilling to see lots of those local powers over energy infrastructure and housing, etc., being taken away. So that may well be something that the sector can work with. Briefly on the risks then. So I've touched on some of these already. But sorry, next slide, please. Yeah, so the first one's on the Climate Change Act framework itself. And I do think there are big debates on these. Robert Jenrick, in his leadership speech at the Conservative Party conference, said he would get rid of carbon budgets. Whilst Kemi didn't match that pledge, she's spoken about out against the net zero target itself. And I think Claire Coutinho, when she announced the change in policy on Drax and on the bioenergy with carbon capture projects, she also hinted at a kind of dissatisfaction with how the carbon budget process was working. And obviously we've got next year probably a vote on the 7th carbon budget, and we know we get the advice from the CCC later this month. So that will be a flashpoint for that debate. Rowing back on some of the regulatory measures we've talked about, oil and gas exploration, I think this has been a long-standing sort of wedge issue that the Conservatives have tried to exploit with Labour, and I think it's something they'll continue doing. Kemi, I think, potentially might revisit the fracking conversation, but I don't know about that. I've not heard anything firm on that. Her chief of staff, it's worth noting, Lee Rowley, was one of the biggest anti-fracking voices in the Conservative Party in the last Parliament, because of his local constituency hating a fracking site. So it may not happen, but I think ideologically, I imagine she would be open to it. I think obviously lots of campaigning at the moment around large-scale solar farms, around pylons, wanting those to be undergrounded, wanting solar to be on roofs. I think, more appetite for deregulation around the natural environment, on things like habitats regulations, although admittedly the current government is doing quite a bit of that already. And then lastly, I suppose the kind of grumblings about Natural England and the Environment Agency are also pretty loud, and have been for a couple of years. So I think that's also one to watch, whether Conservatives might try and clip their wings and bring some of those powers back within DEFRA. Great. Next slide, please. So just to finish, these are less specifically kind of relevant for right now, for this current moment, and more just general tips on engaging the centre right and Conservative politicians on the environment. So I'll try and whiz through these in 5 minutes, so we've got enough time for questions. And apologies if some of this is already quite obvious. Finding the most effective messengers for your campaigns. So I definitely, think it's useful to really think carefully about which MPs you try and get to back your campaign and to be kind of spokespeople for it. It's worth looking at people who've got relevant constituency interests. It's worth looking for people who maybe belong to a certain profession before they became an MP. There's linked to the environment. There are few people involved in green finance and energy in the Conservative Party that, for example, that are potentially of interest. I think it's also worth saying that you might not need to agree with them on everything. To give an example, in the last Parliament, we did quite a bit of work with Mark Jenkinson on white-tailed eagle reintroductions and electric cars. But I know that he's pro coal mining and and then a renewable skeptic. But it was incredibly helpful to have him backing those other environmental campaigns. He's a very counterintuitive messenger. He carried a lot of weight with the rest of the Conservative Party because he wasn't seen as a usual suspect. So I think do be willing, I suppose, not to necessarily agree with everything that anyone says on something. If they're a good messenger on something and they make a good argument, and they're a bit counterintuitive, that can be really effective as a campaigning tool. I think, yeah, linked to that, make sure you work across the Conservative movement. I am a huge fan of Chris Skidmore and Alok Sharma and Conservatives like that. However, their support for environmental campaigns doesn't shift the dial on the Conservative movement so much. People already price in that they're going to be up for something that is green and environmental. You want to try and find the unusual suspects, the counterintuitive voices, people who are not always the kind of deepest greens, to be making your case. Promoting non-political voices. I think for me the key voices that cut through with Conservatives are kind of practitioners, people who've got on the ground experience, people who know the finances of things as well, people kind of involved in the business side, the commercial side of a business. I think farmers definitely really great messengers for Conservatives as well. And then, lastly, work through where you can centre-right aligned organisations and think tanks. I think, speak to in terms of other think tanks working on the environment on the centre right. So you've got Britain Remade, you've got Onward still has a bit on the environment. Centre for Policy Studies is doing stuff on the environment. So do reach out to other centre right think tanks to help promote your campaigns as well. Next slide. Just quickly on language. So do try and use conservative framings where possible. I know there's loads of research out there on this already. I don't, try and use as much of it as possible. Worth, I think, making a distinction between when you're communicating with voters and when you're communicating with MPs. I find the Conservative MPs are slightly different from their voters in that they're more sort of free market. They like those sort of economic co-benefit arguments much more, whereas I think Conservative voters are more likely to buy into the nature, landscape, future generations type frames, the more kind of moral arguments. I think, do also make sure you put forward sort of tangible solutions as well. I think there are, definitely are trade-offs involved in the transition, and I think one of the frustrations I've had fed back to me by Conservative MPs with a lot of messaging from the Green movement is that there's too much cakeism, too much sense that this can all be done in a pain-free way, and it just doesn't. It's just not believed. I think, and it undermines the wider credibility. So don't be afraid to kind of acknowledge the requirements for investment and so on, and sort of acknowledge it's a trade-off, but it's the right thing to do ultimately. In terms of don'ts, I think, avoid the alarmist framing with Conservatives. Climate emergency doesn't go down well at all. I think there's a lot of inherent suspicion among Conservative MPs that the Green movement has a kind of left-wing bias, and so using terms that kind of have an overtly kind of left-wing flavour will invalidate those fears and make them less receptive fundamentally. And then, in terms of your policy mechanisms, I think the kind of regulation, bans, etc., are just less in vogue, and talking more about incentives and market signals and so on, I think tends to work better. So last slide. and this is sort of from an older presentation when it was Conservatives were in government. But I think it's still relevant now as the party starts to put out um, more policy as the result of the policy review. But I do think I'd encourage people to welcome tangible progress. I think recognizing the dynamics that go on within parties, you will often have some allies of the Green cause fighting hard for a kind of a position, a more environmentally friendly position. They will want and some backup from that from outside groups that show that the central party that it was worth making this announcement and upsetting this other interest group that they had to make. And if you don't give them that political credit and you don't give them that political win, the next time they try and have the argument with the centre of the party, they will lose and they'll say there was no political upsides to us announcing this more environmentally friendly position, so why bother? So that's just the political calculus that goes on, and I think it's really vital. I think people who have worked inside conservative governments in recent years have often felt that they've not been able to demonstrate to skeptical people inside those governments that there is political upsides to being green, and I think that's been a big problem. So I think as the opposition starts to flesh out policies, if they are good policies, then I think it's important to celebrate them as a step forwards. I think the last point I'll just pull out is because I'm conscious of time is around scrutiny, and making sure there is equal scrutiny of what the Conservatives did in government and what Labour is doing now, and where Labour is making similar mistakes or has similarly hostile rhetoric or whatever, calling them out for it just as much. And I think there has been a lot of that, in fairness, in the last couple of weeks after Rachel Reeves' speech. But I think it's really important to show Conservatives that the Green movement isn't being favouritist towards a particular political party and is sort of impartial in its application of criticism. And yeah, last point just around making sure that we allow a divergence of solutions. So we should try for an end goal that is net zero by 2050, that is halting nature decline. We should have consensus on those, but we should recognise that Conservatives will want a more market-led route to get there, and will have a different approach perhaps than a more left-wing party. So allowing that pluralism within solutions so that different political traditions can each offer positive environmental solutions without being shut down or told they're invalid, I think is crucial. So I'll leave it there. That was useful and very interesting questions.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, super interesting and really useful. Yeah, let's open up to audience questions. Please feel free to pop your hands up, or also use the chat function, whichever you prefer. Yeah, Zachary.
Thanks a lot. It was very interesting and insightful presentation. My name is Zachary. I'm from the NGO Transport and Environment. I'm based in Brussels, so I work on EU policies, which is, I'm aware, a bit different in terms of how green policies are framed. And actually about that, I have a question about how do you think the polarization around environmental policies should be navigated? Because here, since the European elections last year, there's been a lot of backlash against green policies. It's a more polarizing issue than it used to be, and it's become a political argument for the center right and the right to really differentiate themselves from the other political groups. So as a result, it's harder to even speak about those topics at all. And we as TNE try to have a more friendly language to the conservatives, speaking about competitiveness benefits, market signals, etc. Just like the things you mentioned. But sometimes the fact that we are labeled as a green organization makes it very hard for us to just start a conversation with more conservatives MEPs. So yeah, I was just wondering if you had any ideas of how to overcome that and how to, even if we still talk about economical benefits, etc., how to maybe make green policies or environmental policies a bit less polarizing. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's obviously a huge question you could spend a long time answering. I do think in terms of how to reduce polarization, I suppose I would try and find some narratives that work well with conservatives. Try and find some voices that and it may Green NGOs are probably unlikely to be voices that are kind of trusted and listened to by Conservative MPs. So try and find other partners. I think in the UK, in the transport space, green groups have done a great job working with like motoring organisations, people like Quentin Wilson and so on, getting them more to front up some of these transport campaigns rather than environmental groups. So getting some of them, I think also trying to find, I do think it sort of matters about solutions as well. I think going in to have an argument about what date the ICE phase out should be and the kind of technical details of that, I think is going to be quite hard to have a consensual conversation about that. But there may be other types of policy that would drive forward transport decarbonisation that you could get them talking about positively instead. So I think that is also potentially a route. But yeah, I think it's hard. I think the range of tactics that I had on those last three slides, which actually came from a presentation I did for ECF European Transport Decarbonisation talk. So hopefully lots of those would be relevant in terms of general tips. But yeah, I think it is hard. Some of these issues have now just got into the culture war and have now become quite polarized. And I think there's not a huge amount that can be done other than, as I say, trying to find maybe a slightly different route into the topic and different asks, perhaps that at least give them something useful to be saying on the topic.
Thanks, Zachary. Oliver.
Thanks for the talk, Sam, and thank you also for the work that you, Kitty, and the SEND team do. It is invaluable. I wanted to ask specifically about Victoria and the Shadow DEFRA team, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more, perhaps, in terms of how we might get them to be as enthusiastic champions on nature recovery as they perhaps are at the moment for the farming community. And if you would take a supplementary, perhaps for some on the call, it might be useful for you to say what the opportunities are for working with CERN as well.
Yeah, sure. In terms of how we can work with Victoria, I mean, I think she's very much also a victim of this capacity crunch problem. She is currently hiring for a political advisor who she'll be funding out of her IPSA budget. She's not got a lot of bandwidth at the moment. She has been kind of dealing with issues as they've arisen, so the family farm tax, then the water special measures bill, etc., have been the things that have come before her and required her attention, and so that's what she's commented on. She has said she spoke at our Sen Christmas reception last winter, and she said she was going to work over the next couple of years to develop a much broader kind of environmental agenda. And I think she certainly starts from the place of wanting to defend and celebrate and champion the Environment Act and the kind of last government's record on nature. So I think you've got a sort of willing partner there. I think, yeah, again, I sort of think pulling out a few bits of my presentation. I think definitely going to them with things that the government isn't doing that they should have done. I mean, I know people have already been picking up on things like the bottom trawling ban in MPAs, which was supposed to have been completed at the end of last year, but hasn't been. Finding commitments like that the government is late on or behind schedule on, where there's a kind of broad conservative support for it, or there has been in the past, and sort of feeding those into the Shadow DEFRA team and suggesting that they, make a bit of noise and apply some helpful pressure on those things. I think that would be quite helpful. I think, yeah, more generally, yeah, I suppose how might you engage with Sen? I mean, I'm very happy, Nadia, if you want to share my contact details with people, but we, yeah, are very happy for you to drop us a line about campaigns you're working on any advice that you need. We produce briefings as Sen for MPs ahead of parliamentary debates on the environment. So we love to get briefings from NGOs and others to feed into our own briefings to make sure we've got lots of good stats and good policy asks and so on to advise the MPs on. So please send those in. And yeah, obviously keen to have a kind of regular dialogue on policy as well. And we've got people leading on nature and climate and clean air across the Sen team. So yeah, if you get in touch with me, I can point you in the right direction.
Great question. Thank you. Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Really insightful presentation, really interesting. Yeah, obviously you documented that many in the Conservative Party will be worried about reform as potentially, quite an existential threat to the party. But I guess on the other side of things as well, obviously it won't have escaped attention that a lot of the seats were lost to the Liberal Democrats during the election as well. I mean, I know, there's a challenge for obviously Labour as well in terms of feeling threats from both sides. I wondered if you would be interested to say a bit more on is that kind of discussion materializing much in Conservative circles at the moment of the idea of how do you potentially win back some of those seats from the Lib Dems as well, and how that might factor into things, or is the focus very much, squarely on reform at the moment?
I think there is, I'd say, yeah, the focus, most of the kind of rhetoric, I suppose, on the top is attacking the government. I think the next biggest threat is reform, is seen as that, and then sort of Lib Dems are probably third in terms of how much mental space sort of other parties take up. I think this is actually quite an interesting angle for specific MP engagement. So there will be some MPs who face a Lib Dem challenger in their seats and are quite worried about the Lib Dems. And I think generally I find those Tory Lib Dem marginals or Tory MPs with a Lib Dem challenger in second place are pretty well disposed on the whole to the environmental issues, and they feel the pressure to be good on the environment locally because of the Lib Dem challenge. So I definitely think in terms of a kind of parliamentary engagement strategy, I mean, if you look at the two Conservative supporters of the CAN bill, one of them was Simon Hoare, who faces a Lib Dem challenger in Dorset, and I know that one of his rationales for that is because of that. He senses that it's a kind of greener constituency, and the Lib Dem threat is an example of that. So definitely a productive area, I think, for us. But yeah, I don't think, to be honest, the party's got a good strategy for beating the Lib Dems. I think the Lib Dem. Also, there was that big breakthrough in 2015 in the Southwest. And then I think the Lib Dems have gradually built up their local government base in the last few years. And, obviously we're able to capitalise on the anti-Tory sentiment at the last election as well. I don't think there's really an effective strategy at all in place yet to win those seats back. And I think it will be very hard, to be honest. I think it's easy to attack Labour because they've got a record that they're standing on, whereas the Lib Dems don't ever have to get their hands dirty with the compromises of government. So very hard to, I think, displace those now that they're in. But yeah.
Thanks, Sam. I can't see any more hands up, so if no one has any more questions, you'll get 5 minutes back of your afternoon. But I hope you've all found that as useful as I have. Thanks so much, Sam. Really, really fantastic presentation answers. As usual, I'll be putting the recording up on the website afterwards and also creating a digital guide, which you can find on the website as well. Please do get in touch with any questions, and as Sam mentioned, please do get in touch with Sen as well. They're very, very helpful. And yeah, I think that's everything for today. Thanks again, everyone, and thank you, Sam. Enjoy the rest of your afternoons. Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your questions.